Hi, y'all. Even though this class is about contemporary books and not necessarily about banned books, many of you had mentioned that you were interested in learning more about banning, censorship, the process that brings us to that. And I want to make sure to give you some of that information that y'all were hoping to get out of this course. So, one of the main things that I think people need to understand is that a lot of the terms that get used around book bans are used interchangeably. So sometimes we're talking about banning, sometimes we'll be talking about censorship, book challenges, things that are age appropriate, defining things as pornography. All of those things kind of get bandied about a little bit so that it kind of muddies the water. People don't necessarily understand what it is that's happening with these books, and just to have kind of a firm foundation on what these words officially mean. Now, as English folks, we understand that language gets used in different ways for different reasons. The fact that a politician calls a book pornography when it's not pornography wasn't because they misunderstood, right? We understand that they're doing that as a rhetorical choice. But nevertheless, let's start with some kind of basic foundations of what y'all might want to know. So, the first obvious is going to be a challenge. This is any attempt to remove or restrict reading materials because of an excuse me, because of an objection from any person or group. Challenges in and of themselves are not necessarily a problem. That is when we have a group, or usually it's one individual, who says, I am not feeling this book. I think there are some issues here, and we want to make sure that this book is in the right place for the right audience. So they'll flag it as a challenge. Most libraries and schools have policies in place to work through a challenge. It's usually um, guided by best practices from the American Library Association, but what that looks like is several people, the challenge is accepted by the school or the library, and several people on a committee will look at the challenge, read the book, and then discuss what they want to do with said book. So when we're dealing with those challenges, that's kind of how that should go. The issue that we are probably seeing in most cases is that schools and libraries are not given the time, or they are being pressured to rush through that process where the committee who should be judging the challenge never meets. A challenge comes in and then they just automatically pull the book. So that's where we're starting to have more of a problem. The challenge itself is not necessarily a problem. When a book gets removed, or when a book gets restricted due to a challenge, that's when we have what we would call a banned book. Banning can be something as extreme as a book is entirely removed from circulation. No one is going to be allowed to access this book for whatever reason. More often, what we'll see, especially in schools and libraries, is that the books become restricted in some kind of way. So things that often happen, it might be a YA text written specifically for like 15, 16-year-olds, but it'll get challenged as not being acceptable, and so it'll be moved from the YA category, from the teen library, into the adult-only library. Or some libraries are putting up restrictions where you have to have like parent permission, right? You have to be at least 18 to check out this book, or things along those lines. That's a restriction that keeps that book from getting into circulation. Sometimes it could be simply as moving it from a children's area to an adult area. Sometimes it's those prerequisites, like you have to have pre-approval, you have to have parent approval, something of those nature to get access to the book. Censorship is a bigger issue. Censorship is suppression of books by some kind of outside force. Censorship usually happens in a wave. So challenges are not necessarily a problem. Book banning can be a problem depending on like the results of the challenge, but censorship is much, much bigger. With a censorship issue, now we have not just this one book could be a particular problem, but we start to see specific ideas, certain types of characters, any of those types of things are suddenly being banned and challenged in huge swaths. And normally this is happening, kind of the main telling point with this one is that censorship happens by outside and political forces. So whereas we would see a challenge from maybe a parent or a teacher who would challenge a book and say, I don't know that this is right for where it is placed. Censorship is when politicians make a list and then all of their followers use that list to fill out 200 and some odd censor challenge forms against books because the politician had the rhetoric around it has moved to get those removed from access. In most cases, this is appealing to safety. So, won't someone think of the children? We can't possibly allow them to have any books that contain this type of character, these types of ideas. And so those get moved carte blanche. And that's definitely a problem. Now, when we are dealing with challenges, bans, or censorship, a term that gets bandied about pretty liberally is the idea of something that is age appropriate. Now, but I'm going to big asterisk disclaimer, age appropriate. There is no such thing really as age appropriate because children are not monoliths, right? All 10-year-olds do not act and behave the same way. So there has to be some wiggle room on what would be considered age appropriate. So we generally consider age appropriate to be things in ranges, and usually by grade. So where we were talking about things, a book that is appropriate for kids who are in kindergarten to second grade, things that are appropriate for like 3rd to 5th graders, 6 to 8, 9 to 12. Now, obviously, if a book is appropriate for an 8th grader, it's probably also okay for a 9th grader. If a book is okay for a 9th grader, it's probably going to be okay for an 8th grader. And so when you try to put these hard and fast limits on things, you're going to run into problems. But there are certain things to take into consideration about what makes something age appropriate. This is what literacy experts do. This is what librarians do. And librarians are fantastic at this task. It considers topic, the age range of the students, the age range of the characters, the vocabulary and the sentences being used. Like, would we expect an elementary age student to be able to read a certain level of complexity with the text? That kind of thing. So as we kind of assume what is there, that's what age appropriateness generally means. We also have the issue of literary merit. So when a book is challenged, it will be challenged because it is not age appropriate, or it'll be challenged because it has no literary merit. Okay, so, and this one's important because some of the laws protect our books of literary merit. So they try to end run those precautions by saying books that are challenged have no literary merit. This is a text that has some type of quality for artistic or intellectual value. It doesn't have to be fiction, nonfiction, memoir, kind of subsumed in this is we have the concept of scientific or informational merit, right? So if we were talking about a book on human sexuality that's just biology, then that has merit, even though we wouldn't be like, this is a great work of fiction, right? It doesn't have to be that, as long as there is some intellectual or artistic value to the book. Now, when we talk about age appropriate, when we talk about literary or informational merit, our librarians are the ones who normally curate and weed those collections. So one of the things you might hear regularly is arguments that, well, librarians pull books out all the time. They get rid of books all the time. We're just suggesting that this is one of the books that they should get rid of. And, that's a challenge, fair, but the process of curating and weeding is a maintenance process in the library because they can't keep every book possible. So they're going to choose which books that they include, which ones they buy new, which books they want to keep, and then which ones they're going to discontinue. It's when they discontinue a book that people who are for book bans get real excited because, see, librarians are throwing books away anyway. And that's, sort of. So when a book is weeded from a library, it is usually because it is exceptionally outdated. So the information that's in there is no longer factually correct. Like it's been a decade or two and we know more now. So we usually will pull things that are no longer incorrect. If a book has been in the library for years and years and nobody has checked it out, they will probably go ahead and get rid of that book just to make excuse me, so sorry. Just to make space on the shelf so that books that are going to get used can now come into circulation. The act of curation and weeding is not an ideological issue. So whereas bans and challenges happen because of a particular concern about an issue or a character or a topic, curation is usually much more by the numbers. Like, how old is this book? How many times have people checked it out? And is the information still accurate or not? So those kinds of things go into consideration when a librarian curates the collection. And of course, we need to talk about the word porn. This gets tossed about all the time. I do find this probably the most ridiculous of terms that we see when we talk about banned books, because I think any adult, honestly, anyone 15 and up would know what porn is. Shouldn't need to have to define this. So porn is officially any material that depicts erotic behavior intended to cause sexual excitement. It does not have literary, scientific, or informational value. It is entirely for prurient reasons, right? Like the purpose of the piece that is there. So if we have a book with a sex scene in it, then that is probably not necessarily porn. But if there is nothing else going on and it is just sex scenes, maybe we're dealing with a book that's a book porn. We have issues, and some texts fall into this category, but very few do. So when we're looking at this, it's important to keep in mind all of the things that are already in place. Book bans are not new. Book challenges are not new. The thing that is becoming new is the brazen censorship, right? Where we have these political motivators moving into banning of books. So it's important that we as literary folks understand the laws that are already in place and what's happening around that situation right now. So I want to start with the Miller test. This is a Supreme Court ruling from 1973, so older than me. It has been around a good long while. So with the Miller test, it is called sometimes also the three-prong obscenity test. the Supreme Court ruled that something could not be pulled for ideological issues, and that what they would be looking for are these three things all together. A book cannot cannot just meet one of these things. It has to meet all three of these things in order for something to be considered. Basically, for something to be considered porn, it has to um, meet these issues. So the first, would an average person in the community find the work on the whole to be prurient interest? Okay, so if we sampled a bunch of people, would they look at it and go, yeah, that's porn? Okay, and that's kind of, I think, the major one. The issues that come with this particular part of the Miller test is um, within community standards is really important, because libraries in certain situations for their community might say this is too much for our community, whereas another community might be like, no, we're fine with it. So allowing communities, when librarians curate things, to decide what that community wants is kind of important. It needs to be taken as a whole. So if there is like one line that mentions something, or if there is um, a sex scene among the characters, something like that, but that is not the whole purpose of the book, then it's probably not going to hit this first category. The second one, it depicts or describes patently offensive sexual conduct as defined by state law. So again, we're getting into the specific community standards of how the states might define porn, or what that would look like. Any of those types of things, based on state law, if that's how state law defines something as porn. But remember, it's got to be defined by the state and the state laws and the local community standards. Okay, so both of those have to come into place. And then the third one, the work as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So if we're talking about, again, that book on, right, like about your biology, right, all about sex, understanding these things, that's literally an informational text. People need to know this information, and so it has informational and scientific value, even if it's not of literary value, even if it's not an artistic, beautiful piece of literature, it still has value of a scientific or informational purpose. Okay, so with the Miller test, all three of these things have to apply before we can look at a text and say, yes, this is porn, right? This is obscene. This should be removed. And these three altogether make a pretty high bar for what should be removed or not. Now, here in Oklahoma, we have a couple of specific state laws that we need to address, because they are trying to find their way around the Miller test. And what we are starting to see is that these different laws and policies in various states are actually intimidating to get libraries and schools to self-censor, rather than being forced to by whatever political entity, right, by the Oklahoma State Legislature. So the laws that we have in Oklahoma that we need to pay attention to, we have House Bill 1775. This affects K through 12 libraries and schools. So teachers who have libraries in their classroom, it applies to them, as well as a campus library. It does not apply to public libraries. So, right, very specific for like in schools. The gist of this one is that any book, like books, should avoid talking about gender or race in a way that might cause discomfort. So, as an English person, I would say anything that has a catharsis where there is race or gender is now off the table. And that's like every book, because every person has a race and a gender. So, right, we have this huge generic swath of books. And I would say that it was purposefully written in this vague way in order to cause confusion amongst librarians and teachers who might not know what that means. Okay, like what does it mean to be discomforted by a book, right? So we can read stories. There are many stories set in the Holocaust, right? We read Night, what the night brings. There's all sorts of really beautiful pieces of literature about the Holocaust that I would go ahead and say are discomforting at the minimum. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not worth reading. So 1775, like I said, very broad terminology. It is currently being challenged in the courts. Very likely, most legal scholars have written a couple of articles that is likely to be overturned because it is very specifically trying to avoid books about or books with characters of color, and because it is way too broad to be an effective law. So very likely will be overturned, but the courts take a long time. So still on the books for now. The other less well-known House Bill 3702. This is schools and libraries. This one also includes universities. Anywhere that there is a library. So public library, school library, university library. The way librarians get books from publishers and vendors, the vendor now must confirm that there is no child pornography or obscene materials in their collection and the things that the schools are buying from. Now, we've already talked about this, the idea of child pornography, how we might define that versus how politicians are defining that is different. So this broad and vague, again, use of terms, making it so that it is difficult for librarians to curate their stacks by including contemporary works. If there are dating scenes, kissing scenes, sex scenes, those biology books about like Know Your Body that you would have for like elementary school to teach them about sex ed, any of that would be considered obscene. So now we no longer have it, and it kind of hinders the vendor from selling any materials because they also include books that have something that someone might consider child pornography. Now, once you scratch the surface, none of that is child pornography. If we look at the Miller test, like would a community member look at that and think that that's porn? No. Just no. But because one person does not want that available or things of that nature, it makes everything much more complicated for librarians to get access to these books. This is also a political move because this bill is essentially targeting publishers rather than schools or librarians. So they're not trying to go after teachers and librarians. We all love teachers and librarians naturally. So's dang publishers, right? So it's a rhetorical move about who they're targeting with this one. But the overall effect is that it does keep or make it more difficult for librarians to get access to current books. And finally, we do need to look at a couple of the Trump administration's 2025 executive orders. There were not so many in his first administration, but in 2025, we have had several that are making it, that are giving energy to this idea of censorship. So these are just a few. There have been 150 some odd already. Not all of them deal with books, but several of them do. So probably the first is the orders that talk about words that are able to use in official documents. So if we have a public entity who is trying to get books and it is flagged as a book about women, a book about, right, like a Hispanic character, a black character, Hispanic, black, and women are all three words that are not allowed on this list, right, that are no longer allowed. So the grants that fund the libraries get pulled because you're getting a book that says, you know, black character, woman character, or something along those lines. It's quite an extensive list. I will post this link for you to look at a little bit later, because it's growing. They're adding to it. Next, we have the Executive Order 14224. This one orders that the official language of the United States be English, which means multilingual text, multilingual poetry, anything of that nature is no longer going to be supported. And then we have 14238. Most recently, this was about a week ago, that defunds the Institute of Museum and Library Studies. That is the federal bureaucracy. It is our federal agency that supports museums and libraries with grants and things in order to access the books that they need. So that's the more official organization of libraries, comes from the IMLS. By defunding that, it's not association, by defunding that office, museums and libraries are no longer able to get the funding that they would normally have through grants from the federal government to continue to curate their work. This means communities in rural areas and communities in more impoverished areas who rely on these types of grants to maintain their books no longer have them. Libraries are already starting to lay off their employees, and I imagine we'll start seeing some libraries shut down, or at least temporarily close, because they can't afford to continue running without the support of the IMLS. Now, that's pretty dreary. I do want you to know that there are several organizations that are pushing back on this censorship. Okay, so remember, censorship is a broad political move towards like these broad swaths of books being censored. So we do have the ACLU. They are the national ACLU, and then at various states levels are filing court injunctions against these laws that are causing books to be banned. So already we know the ACLU filed a suit against House Bill 1775 in Oklahoma, and part of that bill was already struck down because they were trying to get it to apply to K-12 and higher ed. The higher ed part got struck down, so now we're just dealing with K-12, which is still also in the works. ACLU is still, I think, the main, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer person bringing the suit, and they're pushing back against it that way. PEN America is a nonprofit organization that supports authors and writers, and they keep track of anything that would make it so that they're not able to express themselves fully. They keep track of these policies and laws. They have several really good reports. A lot of my information comes directly from them about what's happening in different states. We have the National Council for the Teachers of English, which keeps a standing committee on censorship that's been in place for decades. They include book rationales, so that if a book is challenged, teachers and librarians can see like this report on any book has already been created that has explanations for why this book has literary merit. Okay, so those pieces are there. NCTE creates those. And then we have, of course, the American Library Association. They keep track of the numbers in terms of what books are being banned, what commonalities are happening in there, how many challenges are happening, where those challenges are happening, so we can see some data for a broad overview of the issue. So there is a lot of information for folks pushing back against book bans, but it's important, like I said, I want to make sure y'all knew broadly what's happening with these different pieces. I hope this was helpful. I know it's a little bit long for a lecture. Thank you for listening, and as always, email me if you have any questions or concerns.